For some odd reason here in America, we don't see female breasts as family friendly, even though, the main reason they exist is to feed our youngest of children. Not to mention the fact that men are allowed to walk around in public shirtless without anyone complaining, but women can't even wear low-cut t-shirts without someone pitching a fit. This weird dichotomy is especially apparent in Nintendo video games coming over from Japan. Because Nintendo is seen as family-friendly, their localization teams often decide that the best way to keep this rep for games released on their consoles in America is to cover up any sexy bits. One example of this is in Castlevania 4. Keep in mind, this was a game for the Super Nintendo, which means that it was pixelated and that the details weren't always apparent. At one point, you come across a statue of a woman. In the Japanese version, the cloth on her is up against her leg, but in the American version, the cloth also covers her breasts. And it looks kind of ugly and out of place. It reminds me of a child wearing a scarf that's way too big for them. And this is just one example of many that I'll be covering in today's episode of Gnoggin, Nintendo's censorship of things deemed too sexy. The 80s and 90s is where we'll see the most censorship, but that's not to say there isn't any still happening. But we'll start with the NES. Ah yes, 8-bit graphics. It would be pretty challenging to make anything sexy with this level of graphical power, so it would make sense that perhaps the box art would be censored, since box art for NES games often had pieces of art rather than low-res sprites on them. For example, here is the original Japanese box art for Double Dragon 2. It shows off the main characters and the damsel in distress, fighting off some thugs. Now here's the American version. Basically, they made her skirt longer and gave this punk more clothing. It's too sexy for our American eyes. There are quite a number of cases of censored box art, but this one is the most apparent, so we'll quickly jump over to actual game content now. And we will start with the original Final Fantasy, of which the Medusa enemy went from your traditional Medusa in Japan to a clothed one in the Western release. And this won't be the only time Medusa gets altered. In Castlevania 3, the Medusa enemy remains nude, but is changed into a male Medusa. Because that's okay. Castlevania 3 would actually see a lot of changes between versions, as in there are many statues that are given more clothing to cover up those stone breasts. I mean, geez, it's like they don't think we have fine art museums in the States or something. I guess we kinda don't. Instead, we have museums dedicated to things like cheese and balls of yarn. Chrono Trigger on the SNES had a lot of notable censorship in it. For instance, you can steal an article of clothing from a character named Flea. This is her vest, but in Japan, it's her bra. Also, Ayla in the Japanese and European version of the game mentions that she likes strong people, male or female, and Luca gets embarrassed by this. This is a bit of a way to reference that Ayla is supposedly bisexual. But for the US release, they changed like into respect, and quite a number of lines were changed or just flat out removed. Ayla also once talks about how to raise strong children. She gives some pretty hearty advice, but notably in the North American version of the game, the part where she mentions breastfeeding has been completely removed. Yes, because feeding your babies to grow up strong involves breasts, but breasts are bad always. And this isn't the only time that words deemed too sexy would be censored on the SNES. In the SNES version of the championship cutscene for Chun-Li in Street Fighter 2, there are some guys that are talking about how much they would love to date Chun-Li. And the American SNES release sees the word hot changed into cool. And now we finally reach a moment where the male body is censored, which is rare, since apparently males aren't sexy or something. Well, that's a bad sentence to lead into talking about Ness, but I'll leave it here anyway. So at one point in Earthbound, Ness runs around in his pajamas. Well, in Japan he was nude. Look at that adorable boy butt. Speaking of butts, here's another one. In the Japanese version of Final Fantasy VI, we see the butt of a siren, which makes sense being exposed since that's what sirens do in mythology. Be nude and seduce men into the water so that they can eat them. But in the North American release, they wear short shorts. And not only the sirens are affected in this game, many various enemies are further covered up. And perhaps one of the most famous instances of sexy censorship by Nintendo is that of Super Metroid. As in the original Japanese version of the game, when Samus died and her suit exploded off of her, she was naked, while in the West, she was given a swimsuit. However, some have said that this is false because there are no Japanese cartridges with a naked Samus either. So you could say that this myth is busted, but an interview with the creators of Super Metroid revealed the truth. She was originally naked, but then, before the game was even released in Japan, they went ahead and gave her clothing, specifically so that they wouldn't have to do it later when the game was being ported to the US. In Link's Awakening DX, a man would do some fishing for you. Here in the US, he fished out a necklace, while in Japan, it was a bikini top. This item was for a mermaid character, so, you know, topless mermaid character. Even though you couldn't see anything because she was mostly underwater, that's still too sexy. There is also a hippo character that was originally more humanoid, as in she had lumps for breasts, as well as a bit of clothing, posing all fancy-like for this alligator painter as a model. In the West, however, they actually made her completely naked, but removed her more human-like features. So she's basically just a hippo now, with a bow. Moving on to the Nintendo 64, we start with Cruisin' USA. In the arcade version of this title, there are plenty of bikini-clad women holding up signs and handing you trophies. However, in the N64 version, she is given a shirt, but the breast animation remains, which just makes this look odd. Also on the arcade was this cutscene showing the President of the United States in a hot tub with some bikini-clad women. This cutscene was of course removed on the N64. Also, Duke Nukem is a game known for its inclusion of strippers, and that the first chunk of the game takes place in an adult theater. In the N64 version, however, every single bit of sexiness was completely removed, just no longer there in any way, shape, or form. Various Pokemon games saw some censorship for the West as well, such as skirts being lengthened and female swimmers no longer winking. Yeah, they removed winking? Really? And even in Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, the male swimmer is seen in a Speedo in the Jap and Euro releases, but in the US, he is given swimming shorts. And now we make a leap to the modern era, starting with Fire Emblem Awakening. There is DLC which gives you a few beach-themed levels, so of course the characters are wearing swimming outfits. It's a beach, but these shots were too risque for the US, as seen here. Tharja gets her bottom covered with a curtain, and various twinkles get removed, perhaps as a means of making her seem less appealing? Or something? Bravely Default is another game censored for the American audience. Basically, there are a lot of different outfits and armors to wear, and some of them would show too much skin for our poor American souls to handle. So they added extra cloth and armor to these outfits. This is the same thing that happened to the American 3DS version of Dragon Quest VIII, which was originally on the PS2 in its uncensored glory. On the PS2, there are a few outfits with a bit of extra cleavage, but Nintendo needed to have these bits removed when ported to the 3DS. Too sexy. Xenoblade Chronicles X has a character named Lin Li, and she causes problems. In the game, there are tons of clothing options that you can put onto any of the characters, but Lin Li looks young. As in, she's 13, and she can wear the same clothing everyone else can. This has been changed for the Western releases of the game, so now when she puts on the same clothing, the clothing will magically change into something else. Fatal Frame 5, Maiden of Blackwater. This just-released game is being punished to death for the American audience as a form of censorship. The Japanese and European markets got a full release of this game, hard to unlock and completely optional skimpy outfits included, and nothing altered. But for the Americans, not only did they change the ages of the girls from 15 to 18, but they also removed the revealing outfits, and decided not to release the game physically in the US at all. Being download only isn't a problem for small games, but the issue here is that the game is 15 gigabytes. Problem is that a lot of Wii U's only have 8 gigabytes of space, and the only bigger option is 32, so the game will still take half of your space, basically meaning only the players that have external hard drives can play this game at all. Even after all of these changes by Nintendo were made without telling anyone, we still can't have a proper release of this game? And these are all just a few examples of Nintendo censorship. There are, of course, many, many other examples. And I also want to clarify that it is not the lack of scantily clad outfits that upsets people, most people. It's more just the principle of the thing. It should not be a corporation's job to change an artist's creation and decide what we as a people cannot see in someone else's art. We are all either adults or have an adult's permission to be playing these games. So honestly, why? Also, I'd like to point to something interesting I discovered while doing all this research. If you noticed, I pretty much skipped the entire GameCube and Wii era. There are still some bits of censorship during this time, but it was very little comparatively, which I think is interesting. See, in the 80s and 90s, due to Nintendo of America trying to keep hold of that family-friendly market, it would make a bit of sense to censor a few things. For all those years, though, people were constantly complaining about censorship, and these people were always saying how lucky it must be for gamers to live in Japan or Europe where they get all these games uncensored. And sure enough, later on, Nintendo of America learned that sex sells, as does violence. All of this censorship is one of the reasons they are starting to fall behind Sony, and eventually Microsoft. So, come the GameCube and Wii era, they allowed more mature games and censored games very little during this time. But now in this modern era with the 3DS and Wii U, they are taking a few steps backwards. Because now, in this day and age, we have a very vocal minority, people that don't even play games that often, yelling at Nintendo to start censoring video games again. Because breasts are the source of all evil, boobs are misogynistic. And Nintendo is listening. Because they have already had this problem in this region once before, so now it's just happening again. I'm sure they are confused. Because here in America, we don't want any bit of sexualization of fictional female minors. We only want to sexualize the real ones. So now I'm curious about your opinion of censorship. Sure, we don't need scantily cladness and we don't need breasts flopping about in our video games, but again, the principle of the thing. And not even just talking about sexy things. What about the violent censorship, or switching words around to have completely different meanings? What about the censorship of Isla not being bisexual exclusively in the North American version? That isn't the only example of that. We also see it in Paper Mario: The Thousand-Year Door. So is it Nintendo's job to decide for us what we are okay with, or should that be reserved for adults? Let me know what you think down below, and stay awesome.